There is a chilling truth. The number one box office earner in the world in 1939 was a penniless boy, given an allowance of exactly $5 a week. His biological mother in the studio turned Mickey Rooney into a modern-day slave. Forced labor, physical beatings, and robbed of his entire earnings. The price he paid for that cheap $5 was a childhood soaked in chemicals and mental abuse, leading him to spiral into debt and bankruptcy later in life. The studio got rich off his body, and in the end, all he received in return was a drug-ravaged body and empty hands. So how exactly did they manage to enslave a superstar in plain sight? Here is the answer. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in the 1930s was not an artistic commune. It was a heavy industry plant, functionally identical to the steel mills of Pittsburgh or the assembly lines of Ford in Detroit. It was a factory town, complete with its own police force, its own fire department, its own hospital, and its own laws. The product they manufactured was not steel or cars. It was emotional. And like any manufacturing process, it required raw materials. The foreman of this factory was Louis B. Mayer. Mayer was a man of terrifying contradictions. Publicly, he presented himself as a benevolent patriarch, a father figure to his stars. He spoke of family and values. But privately, Mayer operated with the cold feudal logic of a plantation owner. He did not hire actors, he collected them. Mayer viewed the studio's talent roster through a lens of brutal accounting. In the corporate ledgers of MGM, Mickey Rooney was classified as a fixed asset. But unlike a camera lens or a soundstage, a human asset has a flaw. It degrades. A child actor has a specific non-renewable shelf life. There is a limited window of time, perhaps 5 years, perhaps 10, where the combination of youth, cuteness, and energy can be monetized. Mayer understood the concept of human depreciation better than anyone in history. The logic was mathematical and sociopathic. The goal of the studio was to extract maximum value from the asset before it hit puberty, before it aged out, or before it broke. If the machine burned out in the process, it didn't matter, as long as the profit margin exceeded the replacement cost. Mickey Rooney was the most sophisticated high-performance machine Mayer had ever acquired, but he was also the most vulnerable. The mechanism of control began with the contract. In the 1930s, the legal protections for child actors were virtually non-existent. The Coogan Act, designed to protect child earnings, was in its infancy and easily circumvented by creative accounting. When Mickey signed with MGM, he didn't just sign an employment agreement, he signed away his autonomy. The contract gave MGM the right to dictate his physical appearance, his public associations, his diet, and his morality. It included morals clauses that were so vague they could be weaponized to punish him for almost any behavior the studio deemed inconvenient. But the most insidious control was financial. Mickey Rooney's films were generating millions of dollars. Adjusting for inflation, the Andy Hardy series alone was a multi-billion-dollar franchise. The studio was printing money. Mickey, however, saw almost none of it. He was given a paltry allowance, often no more than $5 or $10 a week. The rest was held in trust or siphoned off by his mother and the studio executives who managed his affairs. This was the first layer of the psychological cage, financial slavery. By keeping Mickey cash poor, the studio ensured his dependence. He couldn't run away because he couldn't afford a bus ticket. He couldn't hire a lawyer because he couldn't pay the retainer. He was a prisoner in a golden jail, wearing tuxedos he didn't own, driving cars he didn't hold the title to, living in a house that was essentially a dormitory for the studio's investments. He learned a devastating lesson before he was even legally an adult. You are only valuable when you are working. If you stop working, you starve. By 1937, MGM faced a logistical crisis. The demand for Mickey Rooney was insatiable. The public wanted him in the Andy Hardy films. They wanted him in musicals with Judy Garland. They wanted him in dramas like Boys Town with Spencer Tracy. They wanted him on radio shows. They wanted him on press tours. The studio schedulers crunched the numbers. To meet the release dates required to keep the studio profitable, Mickey needed to be in front of a camera 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. There was only one problem: biology. The human body, particularly the developing body of a teenage boy, is governed by circadian rhythms. It requires sleep to repair tissue, to process memory, and to regulate hormones. A normal 19-year-old boy gets tired. He gets grumpy. He loses focus. For Louis B. Mayer, this biological reality was an unacceptable inefficiency. Every time Mickey yawned, it cost the studio money. Every time a take was ruined because Mickey's eyes were drooping, it burned film stock and labor hours. The executives held meetings to solve this bottleneck. They couldn't change the schedule. The release dates were set in stone. They couldn't clone Mickey. So they decided to fundamentally alter the physiology of the boy. They decided to eliminate the need for sleep. This is the moment the story shifts from exploitation to a crime against humanity. MGM employed a fleet of studio doctors. These men were licensed physicians, bound by the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. But in the Valley of the Giants, the oath was secondary to the production schedule. These doctors were not healers. They were mechanics. Their job was not to keep the actors healthy, but to keep them functional. The protocol they developed for Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland was a precursor to the combat pharmacology used by militaries in World War II. It was a regimen designed to override the body's natural safety switches. It began innocuously. A doctor would visit the set when Mickey was flagging. "Here, Mickey," the doctor would say, offering a pill. "Just a vitamin. It'll pep you up. It's good for your voice." They called them pep pills. They called them vitamins. They were lying. The pills were amphetamines, specifically Benzedrine. At the molecular level, Benzedrine is a central nervous system stimulant. When Mickey swallowed that first pill, the chemical dissolved into his bloodstream and rushed to his brain. It triggered a massive release of norepinephrine and dopamine. The effect was instantaneous and electric. The fatigue that was crushing his bones vanished. His heart rate spiked. His pupils dilated, giving him that signature wide-eyed manic look that audiences mistook for youthful enthusiasm. He felt invincible. He could talk faster, dance harder, and memorize pages of dialogue in seconds. The studio executives watched the dailies, the raw footage, and they were thrilled. The vitamin worked. Mickey was vibrating with energy. He was brighter, faster, louder. The machine was running at 150% capacity. They didn't care that his hands were shaking between takes. They didn't care that he was grinding his teeth. They didn't care that his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. They had solved the biological bottleneck, but they had created a new problem. The human body is not a perpetual motion machine. Amphetamines do not create energy. They borrow it from the future. They burn through the body's reserves, ignoring the signals to stop. After working for 18 or 20 hours under the blazing hot Technicolor lights, which raised the temperature on set to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the crew would finally wrap for the day. Mickey would be sent back to his dressing room or his home, but he couldn't sleep. The Benzedrine was still coursing through his veins. His mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour. He was wired, twitching, pacing the floor. He was physically exhausted but chemically awake. A normal teenager would sleep for 10 hours to recover. Mickey had to be back on set in 4 hours. If he didn't sleep, he would crash the next day. So the studio doctors returned. They offered the solution to the problem they had created. "You need to rest, Mickey. Take this. It will help you turn off." They handed him barbiturates, Seconal, Nembutal. These were powerful sedative hypnotics. They were downers. Mickey would take the pill, and within 20 minutes it would hit him like a sledgehammer. It didn't induce natural restorative sleep. It induced a chemical coma. It simply shut off the lights in his brain. He would collapse, often fully clothed, into a black, dreamless void. This was the cycle, the up and the down. The upper, to strip mine his energy for the camera. The downer, to force his body into suspended animation so it didn't burn out completely. For a teenage boy whose brain was in the most critical stage of development, this was catastrophic. They were chemically rewiring his neurology. They were destroying his ability to regulate his own emotions, his own sleep, his own happiness. They were teaching his body that it did not belong to him. It belonged to the pills. And when the pills stopped working, when the tolerance built up and the chemicals could no longer trick the body, that is when the true torture began. However, biology is stubborn. The human body eventually adapts to even the most potent chemical interventions, a fact that Louis B. Mayer's medical team viewed not as a warning, but as a logistical hurdle. As 1939 turned to 1940, the efficacy of the vitamins began to wane, and the machine began to slow down. The studio's response was not to grant mercy, but to escalate the brutality from pharmacological control to physical conditioning. By 1940, the biological control protocol, the regimen of uppers and downers, began to hit a physiological wall. The human body is resilient. It strives for homeostasis. Over time, Mickey Rooney's central nervous system began to build a tolerance to the amphetamines. The initial dose of benzodrine no longer produced that instant electric snap. The vitamins were losing their potency, but the studio's demands were not decreasing. They were accelerating. MGM had invested millions in the Andy Hardy franchise, and they needed the machine to run faster, not slower. When the pills failed to rouse the exhausted teenagers, the studio executives did not prescribe rest. They escalated the level of force. They moved from chemical manipulation to physical torture. The studio realized that if they couldn't stimulate the brain with drugs, they had to stimulate it with terror. They needed to trigger the body's fight-or-flight response, bypassing the exhaustion to access the raw adrenaline stored in the adrenal glands. This method was crude, brutal, and effective. It became the stuff of dark whispers on the lot, a ritual of abuse that everyone saw but no one stopped. It usually happened in the mid-afternoon during the slump that followed an 18-hour shift. Mickey Rooney or Judy Garland, often huddled together for warmth and comfort, would succumb to the crushing weight of sleep deprivation. They would pass out in their chairs or sometimes collapse right on the floor of the soundstage. The drugs wouldn't wake them. Shaking them wouldn't wake them. Their bodies had entered a state of emergency shutdown. The handlers, understanding orders from the front office, would signal for the treatment. Assistants would drag heavy galvanized buckets onto the set. They filled them with water and large blocks of ice, letting the temperature drop until the water was painful to the touch. Then the handlers, grown men, often twice the size of the teenagers, would grab Mickey and Judy. They didn't gently splash them. They grabbed them by the back of the neck and the hair. They plunged their heads into the freezing water and held them there. Consider the physiology of this moment. This was not just waking up. This was a simulation of drowning. The sudden thermal shock combined with the inability to breathe triggered a primal panic deep within the brainstem. It is known as the mammalian diving reflex, but violent and inverted. The body, convinced it is dying, dumps a massive load of adrenaline into the bloodstream. The heart hammers against the ribs. The lungs scream for air. The handlers would hold them under until the thrashing became frantic. Then they would yank them up. Mickey would emerge gasping, sputtering, his eyes wide with the terror of suffocation, water streaming down his face, his skin shock white and freezing. He was awake. He was hyper-alert. He was terrified. The cruelty of the industry was what happened next. There was no comfort, no towel drying by a caring parent. The makeup artists would rush in immediately. They would dry the face just enough to apply fresh powder. They would cover the redness of the skin. They would fix the hair. "Action!" the director would scream. And Mickey Rooney, his heart still pounding from the sensation of drowning, would turn to the camera and grin. He would tell a joke. He would sing a song about how beautiful life was. The transition from near-death panic to wholesome American joy took less than 60 seconds. This wasn't acting. It was a severe dissociative break. To survive, Mickey had to separate his mind from his body. If the Ice Bucket Protocol proved that MGM viewed Mickey as an animal to be trained, the broken leg incident proved they viewed him as an inanimate object to be repaired. According to Rooney's later accounts, during the filming of a complex musical number, history suggests it was likely during the production of Babes on Broadway or a similar high-intensity shoot, Mickey suffered a catastrophic accident. While executing a dance routine, he landed awkwardly. The pain was blinding. His leg had fractured. In a sane world, this is a medical emergency. A fracture requires immobilization, a cast, and 6 to 8 weeks of rest to allow the bone to knit back together. But in the calculus of Louis B. Mayer, a 6-week delay was a financial disaster. It meant the set sat empty. It meant the release date would be missed. It meant the theaters would have a gap in their schedule. Mayer allegedly told his fixers, "We don't stop." They did not take Mickey to a hospital. They brought a doctor to the studio, a man who again violated every ethical standard of his profession. The doctor did not set the bone for healing. He prepared the leg for performance. He produced a long needle filled with a powerful nerve block, a local anesthetic strong enough to numb a horse. He injected the solution deep into the tissue surrounding the fracture, chemically severing the connection between the damaged bone and Mickey's brain. The pain vanished, but the injury remained. "Lace him up," the director ordered. They put Mickey's dancing shoes back on. They tied the laces tight to act as a makeshift splint. And then they ordered the boy to dance. Watch the footage of Mickey Rooney dancing. He was an athletic, explosive dancer. He stomped, he spun, he jumped off tables. He performed that routine on a broken leg. With every stomp, the jagged ends of the bone were grinding against each other. The soft tissue was being pulverized. The injury was being compounded, turning a clean break into a complex trauma. But because his nerves were deadened, Mickey felt nothing. He smiled. He tapped. He spun. He was destroying his own body to entertain an audience that had no idea he was being cannibalized in real time. He was a marionette, but the strings weren't attached to his limbs. They were injected into his veins. The control extended beyond the physical abuse. It was spatial and psychological. MGM needed to ensure that their investments, Mickey and Judy, did not depreciate due to outside influences. Mayer was terrified that Mickey would get into trouble, talk to the press about his treatment, or simply run away. He was equally terrified that Judy Garland would eat forbidden food and gain weight, violating the strict starvation diet the studio had placed her on. So, the studio created a prison system within the lot. Between scenes, Mickey and Judy were often escorted to their dressing rooms or small trailers. Once they were inside, the doors were locked from the outside. two of the most famous people on planet Earth, the Gold Dust twins, who were idolized by millions, sat in small, windowless rooms, unable to leave. They were inmates. They sat there for hours, waiting for the next dose of pills, waiting for the key to turn in the lock so they could be marched back to the set. It was during these hours of confinement that the bond between Mickey and Judy was forged in fire. They were soldiers in the same trench. They were the only two people on Earth who understood the hell the other was enduring. They developed a dark, frantic humor to cope. They plotted escapes they knew they couldn't execute. They held each other while coming down from the amphetamines, shaking with withdrawal. This confinement warped Mickey's understanding of freedom and love. He learned that authority figures were jailers. He learned that safety was an illusion. He learned that he had no agency over his own movement. Mayer's surveillance network was total. He employed a private intelligence network of spies, informants, and corrupt police officers to watch his stars 24 hours a day. If Mickey went on a date, Mayer knew what restaurant he went to and what he ordered. If he tried to sneak out to a gambling hall, a studio fixer would be there to intercept him. This stripped Mickey of his privacy and his dignity. He was a 19-year-old man who was treated like a dangerous toddler. This infantilization stunted his emotional growth. He was never allowed to make a mistake, never allowed to handle his own money, never allowed to resolve his own conflicts. The studio fixed everything, paid everyone off, and buried every scandal. Mickey Rooney was becoming a man-child, not by choice but by design. The studio needed him to remain a child on screen, so they prevented him from becoming an adult in reality. They arrested his development to preserve his marketability, but the damage to his brain was already done. The years of chemical floods, the sleep deprivation, and the trauma of the ice bucket were rewriting the architecture of his mind. The tragic, chaotic adult that Mickey Rooney would become was being sculpted day by day in the torture chambers of Culver City. We are now approaching the breaking point. The machine was humming, but the boy inside was beginning to fragment. This fragmentation was not merely psychological, it was physiological. While the studio's fixers were busy managing his physical location and financial assets, the chemical cocktail coursing through his veins was silently dismantling the physical architecture of his brain. To understand the erratic, often ridiculed man Mickey Rooney became in his later years, we must move beyond the gossip columns and examine the neurological wreckage left behind by the studio's experiments. When the cameras stopped rolling and the studio system finally collapsed in the 1950s, the public expected Mickey Rooney to grow up. They expected Andy Hardy to become a wise father, a stable husband, and a dignified elder statesman of Hollywood. Instead, they watched a car crash in slow motion. For the next 60 years, the tabloids feasted on Mickey Rooney's life. They turned his pain into a punchline. They mocked his 8 marriages. They chronicled his compulsive gambling, his bankruptcy filings, and his erratic, explosive temper. The narrative was simple and cruel. Mickey Rooney was a washed-up child star, a man of weak character who had been spoiled by fame and ruined by excess. But this narrative ignores the medical reality. In fact, it is a lie. To understand the man Mickey Rooney became, we must stop looking at his morality and start looking at his neurology. We must conduct a forensic analysis of a brain that was subjected to chemical warfare during its most critical developmental window. Modern neuroscience tells us that the human brain does not finish developing until the mid-20s. The last area to mature is the prefrontal cortex. This is the CEO of the brain. It handles impulse control, long-term planning, emotional regulation, and the understanding of consequences. It is the braking system that stops us from doing dangerous or stupid things. From age 14 to 20, the exact years the prefrontal cortex is trying to wire itself, Mickey Rooney was pumped full of high-grade amphetamines. The drugs acted like a chemical cauterization. By constantly flooding his developing brain with artificial stimulants, MGM likely stunted the growth of his impulse control centers. They didn't just make him hyperactive, they chemically froze his emotional maturity. Mickey Rooney didn't marry 8 times because he was a womanizer. He married 8 times because he had the impulse control of a chemically damaged teenager. He lacked the biological hardware to process long-term consequences. He saw something he wanted and he grabbed it, incapable of foreseeing the inevitable crash. He wasn't wild. He was neurologically uninhibited. The damage went deeper than just impulse control. It destroyed his ability to feel happiness. The human brain runs on a reward system driven by a chemical called dopamine. When you eat a good meal, hug a loved one, or accomplish a goal, your brain releases a small trickle of dopamine. It feels good. It makes life worth living. Amphetamines do not release a trickle. They release a tidal wave. For a decade, Mickey's brain was bathed in an ocean of artificial dopamine. His receptors were bombarded so heavily that they eventually downregulated. This means the brain, trying to protect itself from the overstimulation, burned off its own receptors. It raised the baseline for what pleasure felt like. When the drug stopped, the ocean receded. Mickey was left in a desert. Normal life, a sunset, a quiet dinner, a paycheck, registered as nothing. His brain was deaf to ordinary pleasures. This condition is called anhedonia, the inability to feel joy. This explains the gambling. Critics called him a degenerate gambler. He lost millions of dollars he didn't have. But from a neurological perspective, he wasn't chasing money. He was chasing the dopamine rush. He needed the high stakes, the terror of loss, and the thrill of the win just to feel something that resembled the chemical highs of his youth. The gambling hall was the only place that could replicate the intensity of the MGM sound stage. The studio had engineered a man who was perpetually unsatisfied, a machine built for high-speed processing that was suddenly forced to drive at 20 miles per hour. He spent the rest of his life pressing the gas pedal, trying to get the engine to roar again. The tragedy of the biological control program is best understood by looking at its 2 primary victims, Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. They were the 2 lab rats in Mayer's experiment. Judy Garland did not survive the damage. The insecurities planted by the studio, who called her a fat little pig and starved her, combined with the chemical addiction, spiraled into a lifetime of self-destruction. She died at 47 from an accidental overdose of barbiturates, the very same downers the studio had introduced her to. She was the ultimate casualty of the system. Mickey Rooney survived, but survival is a complicated word. He didn't die young, but he lived in a state of chaotic suspension. While Judy turned her pain inward, imploding, Mickey turned his energy outward, exploding. He kept working. He took any role offered to him. He did dinner theater, he did voiceovers, he did commercials. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy that unnerved people. Why? Because work was the only time the conditioning made sense. On a stage under the lights with the adrenaline pumping, he was back in the one place where his altered brain functioned correctly. The studio had trained him to be a performance machine. He was only truly alive when the red light was on. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Mickey's later life was that the financial abuse he suffered as a child repeated itself in his old age. In the 1930s, his mother and the studio executives stole his fortune, justifying it as management. They told him he was too young to understand money. In the 2000s, nearly 80 years later, History repeated itself with sickening precision. Mickey, now in his 90s, fell victim to elder abuse. His stepson, Christopher Aber, took control of Mickey's affairs. Just like the studio bosses of old, Aber restricted Mickey's access to his own money. He blocked Mickey from seeing his friends. He controlled his food. He forced the frail elderly legend to sign autographs for hours to generate cash that Mickey never saw. In 2011, Mickey Rooney famously testified before the U.S. Senate on elder abuse. It was a moment of profound tragic irony. There sat the boy who had been the biggest star in the world, the president of the United States of movies. He was small, withered, and trembling. He told the Senate, "I felt trapped, scared, used, and frustrated. But above all, when a man feels helpless, it's terrible." He wasn't just talking about his stepson. He was talking about Louis B. Mayer. He was talking about the doctors with the needles. He was talking about the ice buckets. The trauma had come full circle. The boy who was owned by the studio died a man who was owned by his handlers. The obituary notices written at the end of his life were kind, but they missed the point. They celebrated his talent and listed his movies, but they rarely listed his scars. Mickey Rooney was not just an actor. He was a canary in the coal mine of modern celebrity culture. He was the prototype for every child star who followed. From Michael Jackson to Britney Spears to the Disney kids of today, he was the first proof of a dark theorem. If you take a human child and treat them as a public utility, you will break them. The forensic evidence is undeniable. Mickey Rooney was a victim of systemic human rights violations. He was subjected to sleep deprivation torture through forced 20-hour workdays, maintained by a state-sanctioned cycle of amphetamines and barbiturates. This abuse extended to distinct physical and financial cruelty. Rooney endured physical trauma, including the use of ice buckets and working with a broken leg while simultaneously suffering from gross financial exploitation. We look back at the black and white films and we see innocence, but that innocence is a special effect. The smile of Andy Hardy is not a smile of joy, it is a rictus of survival. The factory that built Mickey Rooney is gone. The physical walls of MGM have changed, but the machinery is still running. The appetite for youth, the commodification of beauty, and the disposal of the human asset once it depreciates, that has not changed. Mickey Rooney finally earned his sleep, but his ghost should haunt us. He stands as a warning of what happens when we decide that a person is a product. With this forensic profile established, the experience of revisiting Mickey Rooney's filmography undergoes a disturbing transformation. The medical reality of his abuse casts a pall over the technicolor joy he was forced to project. We are no longer simply watching a talented child actor. We are witnessing the documentation of his deterioration frame by frame in movies that the world continues to celebrate as wholesome classics. There is a specific kind of haunting that occurs when you watch a Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer musical from 1939 today. You sit in your living room, perhaps streaming the film in high definition. The colors are vibrant. The costumes are immaculate. The music swells with an orchestral perfection that seems to promise that everything in the world is right and good. And there, in the center of the frame, is Mickey Rooney. He is spinning. He is laughing. He is electric. He looks at Judy Garland with eyes full of adoration and boundless hope. The audience smiles, fueled by a wave of nostalgia for a simpler, more innocent time. But once you know the forensic truth of the Valley of the Giants, the experience of watching these films changes violently. You are no longer watching a musical comedy. You are watching a hostage video. You are witnessing a document of abuse captured at 24 frames per second. That manic energy is not joy, it is benzodrine. That desperate desire to please is not character acting. It is the fear of the ice bucket. That innocence is a chemical fabrication maintained by a studio that systematically severed the boy's connection to his own reality. We, the audience, are complicit. For 80 years, we have consumed the product without asking about the manufacturing process. We accepted the smile and ignored the scream that was trapped behind the teeth. If the actions taken by Louis B. Mayer and the MGM doctors were committed today, they would not result in a lawsuit. They would result in a trial at The Hague. Let us be uncomfortably specific about the terminology we use. When a regime takes a human being, strips them of their identity, forces them into labor camps, controls their caloric intake, administers mind-altering drugs against their will to increase productivity, and uses water-based torture to punish non-compliance, we have a word for that. We do not call it show business. We call it a war crime. Yet history has been kind to the perpetrators. Louis B. Mayer is remembered as a titan of industry, a visionary who built the Dream Factory. His name is etched on buildings and awards. We celebrate the golden age of Hollywood as a peak of American culture. But the golden age was built on a foundation of human bones. It was an industry that operated with the same moral vacuum as a Victorian coal mine, only the soot was covered in grease paint. Mickey Rooney was the coal. He burned brighter than anyone else, and because he burned so bright, he burned out. And when the ash was all that remained, the industry simply swept him away and looked for the next lump of coal. It is a miracle of biology that Mickey Rooney lived to be 93 years old. By all medical logic, his heart should have exploded in 1945. His liver should have failed. His brain, battered by chemical storms, should have surrendered. But he survived, and his survival became his punishment. He had to live for 70 years in the shadow of the boy he used to be. He had to walk down the street and have strangers demand that he be Andy Hardy. They wanted the 19-year-old puppet. They recoiled when they saw the angry, confused, twice bankrupt old man. The public loved the character, but they despised the victim. When Mickey appeared on talk shows in the 1970s and 80s, manic and sweating, telling jokes that didn't land, people laughed at him. They didn't see the long-term neurological damage of amphetamine abuse. They didn't see a man whose dopamine receptors had been scorched earth. They saw a clown who didn't know when to leave the stage. He was trapped in a paradox. He was the most successful actor in history, yet he died with almost nothing. He was the most loved teenager in America, yet he died feeling profoundly unloved. He gave the world everything, and in return, the world took his childhood, his sanity, and his dignity. Let us return to the image that started this investigation. Imagine a split screen. On the left side, we see the Mickey Rooney of the tabloids, the caricature, the man with 8 wives, the man shouting at the clouds, the has-been. The world looks at this image and sneers. We judge him for his lack of discipline. We judge him for his chaotic life. We condemn him as a failure of morality. On the right side, we see the truth, a war hero, a survivor of a 10-year siege, a man who endured torture, chemical experimentation, and psychological imprisonment, yet still managed to stand up and entertain millions of people to keep the darkness at bay. He was a soldier who fought on the front lines of the entertainment industry until his ammunition ran out. He took the pills so we could have the dreams. He took the pain so we could have the laughter. With his final departure, we didn't just lose a movie star. We lost the last witness to a crime scene that has been covered up by nostalgia. The machinery of Hollywood has evolved, but it hasn't stopped. The ice buckets have been replaced by social media shaming. The amphetamines have been replaced by different pressures. The consumption of the child star continues, a ceaseless appetite for youth and destruction. So, the next time you see that black and white footage of a young boy dancing with frantic, impossible energy, do not just applaud the talent. Look closer at his eyes. Look past the technicolor sparkle. Ask yourself the question that Louis B. Mayer was too profitable to ask, and that we were too entertained to answer. If you knew that the smile on the screen was powered by the scream in the dressing room, would you still have bought the ticket? That question becomes even more difficult to answer when we realize Mickey was not suffering in a vacuum. He was part of a matched set. To fully comprehend the systemic nature of MGM's cruelty, we must look at the only other person on earth who truly understood his pain, his twin in tragedy, and how their shared trauma rippled outward, repeating itself with sickening precision until the very end of Mickey's life. To fully grasp the magnitude of what Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer did to Mickey Rooney, one cannot look at him in isolation. One must look at his mirror image, Judy Garland. They were not just co-stars. They were not just friends. They were trauma-bonded siblings in a war zone that the rest of the world saw as a playground. They were the Gold Dust Twins, a marketing term that inadvertently revealed their true status. They were commodities, ground down to dust to create gold for someone else. In the decades following their escape from the studio, their relationship was haunting. When they met as adults, they didn't reminisce about the good times. They compared scars. There is a documented history of their frantic, codependent need for one another. When Judy was spiraling into the depths of her addiction, the inevitable result of the pills Mayer had forced down her throat since age 16, Mickey was often the only one who could reach her. Why? Because he was the only other person on earth who knew the specific frequency of the torture. He knew what the treatment meant. He knew the terror of the 4 a.m. wake-up call. He knew the taste of the Benzedrine. When Judy Garland looked at Mickey Rooney, she didn't see the famous actor. She saw the boy shivering next to her in the ice bucket. Their adult lives followed a terrifyingly parallel trajectory of destruction. Both suffered from chronic financial instability. Both were plagued by substance abuse issues. Both were exploited by partners and agents who saw them as ATMs rather than human beings. When Judy died in 1969, a part of Mickey died with her. Her death was not an accident. It was a slow-motion execution that began in 1939. Mickey saw his own potential fate in her coffin. He realized that the machine didn't just break you, it killed you, even if it took 30 years to finish the job. As Mickey entered his twilight years, the narrative should have shifted to one of peace. He was a legend. He had won an honorary Academy Award. He should have been resting in a mansion, surrounded by nurses and accolades. But the cycle of theft that began in his childhood re-emerged with a vengeance. In the 2000s, Mickey fell under the control of his stepson, Christopher Aber. The details of this period are a carbon copy of his childhood under Louis B. Mayer, proving that the predators of Hollywood had evolved but their methods remained identical. Aber took control of Mickey's finances. He seized his passport. He confiscated his identification cards. He controlled Mickey's access to food and medication. It was the golden prison all over again. Mickey was forced to travel the country, attending autograph conventions. He would sit for hours, a frail old man with trembling hands, signing his name on photos of Andy Hardy. He was paraded out like a show pony. The money earned from these grueling sessions, thousands of dollars a day, vanished into accounts Mickey couldn't access. He was in his late 80s, working as a forced laborer in his own life. He was terrified. He was hungry. He was trapped. But this time, the boy in the machine decided to scream. In a moment of supreme courage that rivaled any performance he ever gave on screen, Mickey Rooney did the one thing Louis B. Mayer had trained him never to do. He went to the authorities. On March 2, 2011, the 90-year-old actor appeared before a special U.S. Senate Committee on Aging. The room was silent. The senators, accustomed to policy briefings and dry statistics, looked down at the small witness table. There sat Mickey Rooney. He was diminished by age, but his voice was steady. He didn't tell jokes. He didn't tap dance. He read a prepared statement that stripped away the glamour of his celebrity and laid bare the horror of his reality. I felt trapped, scared, used, and frustrated, he told the Senate. But above all, when a man feels helpless, it's terrible. He described the isolation. He described the theft. He described the fear of retaliation, the same fear he had felt when he was 19 and terrified that Mayer would destroy him if he spoke up. If it can happen to me, he said, looking directly at the senators, it can happen to anyone. This was not just a hearing about elder abuse. For the astute observer, this was Mickey Rooney finally testifying against MGM. He was describing the same dynamic of powerlessness, the same commodification of his body, the same theft of his agency that had defined his entire existence. He was testifying against the very concept of the handler. The final forensic proof of Mickey Rooney's tragic life is found in his will. When he finally passed away in 2014, after a career spanning 80 years and hundreds of movies, his personal estate was valued at roughly $18,000. $18,000. He was buried in a suit he likely didn't pay for. His family fought over the remains. The tabloids ran one last cycle of stories about his sad end, unaware that the poverty was not a result of bad spending. It was the result of a lifetime of systematic extraction. From the moment he signed his contract in 1937 to the moment he died, Mickey Rooney was a resource to be mined. His mother mined him. Louis B. Mayer mined him. The studio doctors mined him. His managers mined him. His stepson mined him. They took the energy. They took the sleep. They took the money. They took the peace. And yet, despite the totality of the theft, they could not take the talent. Watch a clip of him in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Watch him in The Human Comedy. There is a spark there, a raw, undeniable humanity that no drug could extinguish and no thief could steal. The story of Mickey Rooney is not a biography. It is a warning label on the package of the entertainment industry. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the child stars of today. When we see a teenage pop star having a public meltdown, shaving their head, or crashing their car, are we seeing a lack of discipline? Or are we seeing the modern equivalent of the biological control protocol? Are we seeing a brain underdeveloped and overstimulated, breaking under the strain of being a public asset? The ice buckets are gone, replaced by the 24-hour surveillance of social media. The benzedrine is gone, replaced by a different pharmacopoeia of performance enhancers and mood stabilizers. But the factory remains. Mickey Rooney was the first. He was the prototype, and his ghost stands at the gates of every studio in Hollywood, a small trembling figure with a broken leg and a smile painted on his face, whispering the truth to anyone who will listen. The machine does not love you. The machine only knows how to eat. We must pause here to acknowledge the terrifying efficiency of this system. It wasn't just that they abused him, it was that they erased the evidence of the abuse as it was happening. The genius of Louis B. Mayer's machine was that it didn't just manufacture films. It manufactured a reality where Mickey Rooney's pain was invisible. When the boy was screaming inside, the audience only saw the character singing. This disconnect created a psychological schism that no amount of money could ever heal. The public saw a comedy. The actor was living a horror movie, and because the product was so wholesome, no one ever thought to check the factory conditions. The tragedy wasn't just the abuse, it was the applause that drowned it out. History has long searched for the villain in the Mickey Rooney story. For years, the finger was pointed at Mickey himself. He was the villain of his own life, the reckless spender, the bad husband, the angry drunk. We blame the victim because it was easier than blaming the dream. If we admit that Mickey Rooney was innocent, we have to admit that the movies we love were created by a monster. That monster was not a single person. It was the studio system. It was an industrial machine that viewed human beings as chattel, movable property. Louis B. Mayer was not a father figure. He was a factory foreman. The studio doctors were not healers. They were engineers of biology. They looked at a human boy and saw a battery. They drained the energy until the battery was dead, and then they threw it in the trash and blamed the battery for not holding a charge. We return to where we began, the image of the war criminal versus the hero. Mickey Rooney lived out his final years with the reputation of a chaotic, broken man. He was judged by the world for the wreckage of his personal life. But imagine if we judged a soldier returning from a POW camp by the same standards. If a soldier came home from war with shattered nerves, unable to sleep, flinching at loud noises, and struggling to hold down a job, we would not mock him. We would not call him a has-been. We would give him a medal. We would acknowledge that his brokenness was the price of his service. Mickey Rooney fought a war for our entertainment. He took the pills. He took the beatings. He froze in the ice. He danced on the broken bone. He did it all so that in the dark of the movie theater, we could believe in the American dream. He sacrificed his reality to protect our fantasy. So as we close the file on the life of Mickey Rooney, we are left with one final haunting image. We see the biggest star in the world standing 5 feet 2 inches tall, surrounded by the gold and velvet of Hollywood. The applause is deafening. The camera is rolling. He is smiling that famous, infectious Andy Hardy smile. But now you know what is coursing through his veins. You know the ice water is dripping down his back. You know the door is locked from the outside. We looked at a boy screaming for help, and we called it entertainment. If we are the audience that applauded the torture, who is the real villain of this story?